Marcus Fields sat across the desk from Craig Delaney, his expression calm, unreadable. The specific stillness of a man who had already, in the 4 seconds before Craig opened his mouth, understood exactly what was about to happen. Patricia Voss sat beside Craig, a manila folder already prepared and closed on the desk in front of her. The specific procedural readiness of someone who had done this before and would do it again without much difficulty. "We're restructuring plant leadership," Craig said, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this exact sentence more than once. "Effective today, your position is eliminated." Marcus didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. "This is about the maintenance interval proposal. This is about modernizing how this plant operates," Craig said. "I need people aligned with that direction." Marcus nodded once, stood. He didn't reach for anything on the desk that had been his for 6 years, except a small, worn toolkit sitting on the shelf behind him. The same one he'd carried since the earliest days of a company most people in this building had never heard of, because it had stopped existing under its original name decades ago. He walked out without another word. In the parking lot, sitting in his truck, he took out his phone and made a single call. "This is Marcus Fields," he said, his voice completely level. No anger in it, simply fact. "I need you to fire every single one of them." Craig Delaney had just fired a man he assumed was replaceable. He had no idea he'd just fired his own boss's boss's boss, and that the call being made from that parking lot was about to end 3 careers before the end of the week. If something about this moment already has your attention, if you can feel exactly what's about to happen, hit the like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we tell stories like this one every single week. Drop your country in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's understand exactly who Marcus Fields actually is. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been moving through the production floor with the specific, unhurried competence of a man who had spent his entire adult life around exactly this kind of machinery. Pausing at a station, tilting his head slightly, identifying a bearing running a half-degree hotter than it should have been before any sensor had flagged it. Walking a younger technician through the diagnosis and fix rather than simply doing it himself and moving on. 26 years earlier, a much younger Marcus had stood in a rented garage bay at 11 at night, building his first precision component entirely by hand. The specific exhausted pride of a man starting something from absolutely nothing. He had built that company. One contract, one hire, one piece of equipment at a time, over 18 years, until an industrial holding group made an offer large enough that walking away no longer felt like abandoning something. He'd sold it, became, quietly and without any fanfare he ever sought out, a genuinely wealthy man. He had not retired, had not started a second company either. 6 years ago, restless in the specific way of a man who had spent his life solving tangible physical problems and found boardrooms and quarterly reviews a poor substitute for the actual work, Marcus had arranged, through channels inside the holding company's own structure, using a hiring process that revealed nothing about his relationship to ownership, to take a hands-on operations lead role at one of the group's manufacturing plants. Nobody at this plant knew that Marcus Fields' name sat, several layers up an ownership chart most of them had never had reason to examine, as the controlling shareholder of the company that owned the building they worked in every day. There was a reason safety was never negotiable for him, and it went back further than the sale, further than the garage bay. In his company's lean early years, before he'd had the resources to properly maintain every piece of equipment on his floor, A worker had lost 2 fingers to a machine Marcus had deferred maintenance on because he genuinely couldn't yet afford otherwise. Nobody had died, but Marcus had paid every medical bill personally, kept the man employed in a different role for the rest of his career, and had never once, in the decades since, allowed himself to treat safety standards as a line item open to negotiation. That morning, 3 weeks before the firing, Marcus had reviewed the maintenance interval proposal Craig had circulated to plant leadership. He'd recognized immediately, with the specific clarity of direct experience, exactly what it actually risked. He drafted a detailed, professional objection. Failure rates, safety margins, the technical reality of what extending maintenance intervals meant on equipment running this many cycles per shift. Because he'd learned, decades ago, that being right wasn't enough. You had to be right in writing. Marcus had presented the objection directly to Craig, calmly, with the full data behind it. "I understand the concern," Craig had said, "but we need to find efficiencies. This plant's maintenance spend is significantly above regional benchmarks. It's above benchmark because this equipment runs safely," Marcus said. "Cutting that interval doesn't save money. It just moves the cost to whenever something fails." Craig's expression had tightened, not at the argument itself, but at being challenged in front of Daniel Osei, who sat quietly through the entire meeting, saying nothing, despite having exactly the technical background required to know Marcus was correct. "I appreciate the input," Craig had said, "but this is happening." 2 other senior staff members had supported Marcus's objection in writing over the following days, a formal, documented position that Craig experienced not as useful information, but as a coalition assembling against him. Craig had met with Patricia and Daniel 2 days after that. "Fields is a problem," he'd said. "He's building a coalition against this plan. I want him out, along with anyone who signed that memo with him." Patricia had hesitated. The specific brief, suppressed discomfort of someone who recognized an injustice clearly enough to feel it, and calculated, quickly, that objecting would cost her more professionally than simply complying. "On what grounds?" "Restructuring," Craig had said. "We're modernizing plant leadership. Draft it that way." Daniel had said nothing at all. His silence carried the specific complicity of a man who had exactly the knowledge required to know what was actually happening, and chose, deliberately, not to spend it. The terminations had been scheduled for the following Monday. Marcus and both of his colleagues, in a single afternoon. Right here, before you hear what happens next, subscribe if you haven't already. Because the phone call in that parking lot is the entire reason this story exists. Hit the bell. Drop your country in the comments. We're reading every single one. Now, watch what happens when Marcus Fields decides who he actually is going to be. Marcus sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long moment after walking out of Craig's office, the folder Patricia had prepared still sitting closed on a desk he'd never see again, his own small toolkit resting on the passenger seat beside him. He had spent 6 years choosing anonymity specifically because he wanted his work judged on its own merit, not his wealth, not a title behind a name, simply whether the floor ran correctly and whether the people on it went home safely at the end of every shift. Some part of him, even now, sitting in that parking lot with a termination that should never have happened, still fresh behind him, resisted the idea of ending that anonymity simply to save his own job. But this wasn't only about his own job anymore. 2 colleagues, people with families, with mortgages, with nothing resembling the financial cushion Marcus had quietly built for himself over decades, had just lost their positions over a safety objection that was entirely, provably correct. He reached for his phone. He called the holding company's general counsel, a relationship maintained quietly, used rarely, reserved for exactly this kind of moment. "This is Marcus Fields," he said, his voice completely level. "I was terminated from the plant today, along with 2 colleagues, over a safety objection I raised regarding equipment maintenance intervals. I want a full review of the decision, and I want it done by end of week." "Understood, sir. What are you looking for as an outcome?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out through his windshield at the building he had built, indirectly, through the sale of a company that had eventually become this one. "I need you to fire every single one of them," he said. "Delaney, Voss, Osei, all 3, for cause, with full documentation of what actually happened, and reinstate my 2 colleagues with full back pay. And you, sir? I'll decide what I'm doing about my own position separately," Marcus said. "Start with them." 2 days later, Marcus walked back into the plant, not as a fired employee attempting to reapply, but through the front entrance beside the holding company's general counsel, the specific unhurried authority of a man who no longer needed to hide anything he'd spent 6 years deliberately keeping quiet. Craig was called into a conference room where Marcus was already seated, a small stack of documents arranged neatly in front of him. Craig's expression moved from confusion into disbelief as the general counsel laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the ownership structure connecting Marcus Fields to the holding company that owned this exact plant. "This doesn't make sense," Craig said. "It makes complete sense," Marcus said, even, unhurried. "I've worked this floor for 6 years because I wanted to do real work, judged on its own merit. You fired me, and 2 people who were right, because I told you the truth about something dangerous, and you couldn't handle being told." Patricia was brought in separately, receiving the same documented, factual account of exactly what her own decision had actually been, stripped entirely of the corporate language that had obscured it. Daniel, afterward, received the same. The specific technical knowledge he'd chosen to withhold now laid out plainly against him. All 3 terminations were processed for cause, with full documentation. Not a dramatic public spectacle, but the same quiet, procedural seriousness Marcus had applied to every meaningful decision across his entire career. His 2 colleagues were reinstated within the same week. Full back pay confirmed. A formal written apology attached to both of their files. The general counsel offered Marcus, formally, the regional vice president position Craig had just vacated. "I don't want that job," Marcus said. "I want my old one back. Operations lead, same floor, same work." "You understand people will know now," the general counsel said, "who you actually are." "Yeah," Marcus said. "I've thought about that." 1 week later, Marcus walked the production floor again, no longer incognito, the plant staff having learned, in the specific way word travels fast through any workplace, exactly who their operations lead had actually been all along. Nobody treated him differently in the ways that mattered. He still checked a bearing by sound before any sensor caught it. Still walked a technician through a fix, rather than simply doing it for them and moving on. A younger worker passing him near the line slowed slightly. "Didn't know who you were, Mr. Fields." "Still the same guy," Marcus said, just with better hearing for nonsense now. He kept walking the floor. The same unhurried competence he'd carried for 6 years. The same work he had chosen specifically because it had never once, until 3 weeks ago, required anyone to know what he was actually worth. And the same work he intended to keep doing, exactly the same way, now that they did. If Marcus's story stayed with you, if you understand what it means to hold real power quietly and only use it when it actually matters, share this video right now with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we bring you stories like this one every single week. Hit that like button if this one got you. And drop a comment below, where in the world are you watching from? We read every single one, and we want to know who's out there carrying stories like Marcus carried his. Until next time, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who could end everything with a single phone call and chooses not to until they absolutely have to.